Alrighty. So let's go over the different types of plants and alternation of generations. So there are two main categories of plants. You have non-vascular plants, and then you have vascular plants. Now, the root vascular simply means vessels, and non means no. So these plants, the non-vascular plants, have no vessels, meaning that they are very simple. They don't have a lot of complicated tubing that delivers nutrients or water or whatever throughout the plant. So these plants are going to be very, very simple. They usually grow really close to the ground, and they are very thin because each cell in the plant has to do a little bit of everything. It has to absorb water, do the photosynthesis, store stuff. Each cell does a little bit of everything. So these are going to be like your mosses and your liverworts. Those are two examples. Now your vascular plants, these are just vessels. These are all the plants that have vessels, and you can divide vascular plants up into two different categories. You have angiosperms and gymnosperms. Now gymno, that root means bare. So these are going to be your plants that have cones. They reproduce asexually with cones. So like think your pine trees, your ginkgo trees, anything like that. Angiosperms, on the other hand, they reproduce sexually with flowers. So anything that you see that has a flower on it would be considered an angiosperm. And there's a bunch of different examples. Apple tree is my go-to here. Hydrangeas, daisies, anything like that would be considered an angiosperm. Now, any type of vascular plant is going to reproduce with seeds. Flowers produce seeds, pine cones produce seeds, and they all do that in their own way. Non-vascular plants do not have seeds. They reproduce just with spores. I'm going to get into that more in a second. So, how exactly do plants reproduce? That is a more complicated concept called alternation of generations. So, typically, whenever we're looking at a human body or any animal body in general, if you look at a cell, any body cell, any somatic cell, it's going to have two copies of the chromosomes, and we call that a diploid cell. But the sex cells, or the gametes, they only have the one copy, and they are considered haploid because they only have the one. And the reason they're haploid is because, say this one is a sperm, and this one over here is an egg. Whenever these two combine, the 1 plus 1 equals 2, which then gives you a diploid human, animal, capybara, whatever. So whenever you're looking at a plant, most of the time the plant you see, I'm just going to use a tree, for example. We'll use apple tree. The plant that you see is what we call a sporophyte. And a sporophyte is a really fancy name for a plant that is diploid, meaning all of the cells in this tree, the stems, the leaves, the bark, the apples, the stuff inside of the apples, those are all going to be diploid cells. Now, what the sporophyte does is it will create spores that are haploid. And it does this by meiosis. Now, that's where things get weird. The spores will continue to produce through meiosis, and they will create what we call the gametophyte. And then the gametophyte will go through more mitosis and make the actual gametes for the plant. This would be your male sex cell, which would we call pollen, and the female sex cell, which we call the ovules, which is basically the human equivalent of an egg. And then, of course, when you add a piece of pollen and ovule together, they recombine to make a sporophyte. You plant the seed, and then you get an actual tree again. So, main thing you need to know, whenever you're looking at a plant, you're looking at the sporophyte stage. That's the main stage. And then the really, really tiny part that you can't see, the pollen, the ovules inside the eggs and the flowers, whatever, those are your gametophytes, and they are going to be haploid. Because, again, you combine the egg and the sperm to get a diploid baby or zygote. And the zygotes in this case, again, depending on the plant, are going to be your seeds. Your seeds are basically like your little baby embryo plant things. Now, all of these different categories do things a little bit differently. Non-vascular plants do not have seeds, so they kind of skip that part, and then they just produce the spores that grow into like little mini plants. There's no really seed stage there. With angiosperms, you have flowers. So I'm going to draw a really crappy flower. Now, most flowers have male and female parts. The male parts kind of look like antennae, like this. This little stalk thing here is called the filament, and the head is called the anther. The anther is the part that produces pollen, which is the male plant gamete. So this little thing produces pollen. And then in the middle, you have what's called the pistil, which is the female part. Now, at the top of the pistil, you have what's called the stigma, which is very sticky, called the sticky stigma. That'll help you remember it. The pollen will stick to the stigma, then it will grow down this tube, which is called a style. And then at the bottom of this tube, you have the ovary. And inside the ovary, you have the little ovules. So once the pollen grows down this tube and fertilizes one of the ovules, this will turn into a seed. And then depending on the species, the whole flower will turn into a fruit. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it just turns into a bulb. But sometimes it turns into a fruit. It just depends on the type. Now with the gymnosperm, they use cones. Now a lot of plants have different cones for male and female. For example, if you're looking at a pine tree, the female cones look like the prickly things you find on the ground, and the male cones look like those little yellow poofy things. You grind them up between your fingers and your fingers turn all yellow. That is a male pine cone, and the big spiky ones are the females. So what happens here is that the male pine cone will produce the little pollen, and the pollen will stick to the outside of a cone. Now, before it opens up, like you normally see them on the ground, the cone will be all closed up and tight. So the pollen will stick to the outside of the cone. It will actually grow inside where the little ovules are, the little eggs. It'll fertilize the eggs, and then once the pine cone is all fertilized, then it will start to open up so the seeds can drop out onto the ground and begin to grow.